The snow came down like judgment on the raw little town of Buffalo Gap, driven hard by a wind that screamed off the peaks of Black Mesa. It was the 23rd of January in the year 1855, and the cold had teeth. The kind of cold that found every gap in a man's coat, every crack in a wall, every weakness in a body already pushed beyond its limits. The kind of cold that killed without mercy and left the dead frozen in whatever posture they had fallen stiff as carved wood until the spring thaw. Violet Weber knelt in the churned slush outside the eating house, her dress soaked through and rigid as sailcloth. Her bare feet had gone numb 2 hours past. Now they were only distant aches, pale shapes she could barely recognize as her own. She clutched 2 swaddled infants against her chest, twins, a boy and a girl born too small and too soon in a room, with no heat and no hope. Their faces were slack with hunger and cold, their whimpers so faint they were nearly lost beneath the howl of the wind. Their lips had taken on a bluish tinge that made her stomach twist with terror every time she looked down. Men on the boardwalk pulled their coats tighter and looked away. A freighter in a beaverskin hat spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the snow and muttered something about bad luck following certain folks like a curse. Another man crossed the street entirely, his boots crunching through drifts that came up past his knees, as if poverty were a contagion that might spread through proximity, as if misfortune could leap from one body to another, like some invisible plague. On the hotel porch, a tall woman in severe mourning black stood with her arms crossed tight across her chest. Winifred Calder, proprietor of the eating house, and the only boarding house that would take lodgers in Buffalo Gap, pointed at Violet with one gloved hand as though she were indicating a stain on the street that someone ought to scrub away. "Off my porch," she said sharply to the men loitering near the door, her voice cutting through the wind. "She can beg at the dump if she must, but not here. Not where decent people come to eat." One of the younger men shifted his weight from foot to foot, his face troubled. "Mrs. Calder, she's got babies. And I have a business," Winifred cut him off without looking at him, "which does not include feeding women who cannot pay their debts and will not do honest work to settle them." It was a lie, of course. Violet had offered to work. She had offered to scrub floors, to haul water, to do laundry, until her hands bled. But Winifred had turned her away each time, with the same cold expression, the same clipped words about standards and reputations. The truth was simpler and crueler. Winifred Calder did not want a desperate widow with 2 sickly infants, making the other boarders uncomfortable. Bad for business to have reminders of how quickly fortune could turn, how easily any of them might end up kneeling in the snow. Up the middle of the street, moving through the storm like a figure carved from shadow and stone, walked a man who did not belong to Buffalo Gap. He was Lakota tall and broad-shouldered, his long braids dusted white with snow. A heavy buffalo robe wrapped his body over worn buckskin leggings and a fringed shirt that had seen hard use. Around his throat hung a string of blue and red trade beads, bright as drops of blood against the gray world, the only color visible in the whole frozen street. His face was weathered by wind and sun carved into sharp planes and deep-set eyes that missed nothing. He carried himself with the quiet, unhurried confidence of a man who had walked through harder storms than this and come out the other side alive. His name was Chask, which in his language meant firstborn son, though there was no one left in his family to remember that now. His father had died in the smallpox year, his mother the winter after. He had a sister somewhere to the north, married into another band, but he had not seen her in 3 years. He lived now with a small group of kinsmen along Crow Wing Creek in the breaks and coulees east of Black Mesa, where the land was too rough for white settlers and the hunting still passable if a man knew where to look. As Winifred Calder's gloved hand jabbed the air, as the men on the boardwalk turned their backs, Chaske altered his path. Instead of passing by, as any sensible man would have done, he walked directly toward the kneeling woman and her dying children. A deputy lounging beneath the eaves straightened up his hand, dropping to the walnut grip of his revolver. He was a thick-necked man named Foster, with a reputation for casual violence. "Keep walking, Indian," he said, not quite shouting, but loud enough to carry. "We don't need your kind making trouble here." Chasky acted as though he had not heard. He knelt in the snow beside Violet, close enough to see the blue tinge on her lips, the way her fingers trembled uncontrollably as she tried to shield the babies from the wind. He could feel the cold radiating off her body, could see how close she was to simply lying down in the snow and letting it take her. He had seen that look before during the starving times. It was the look of someone who had run out of reasons to keep fighting. He opened his parfleche bag, a flat rawhide pouch decorated with geometric patterns in ochre and black, and drew out a strip of dried venison. He placed it in her numb hand, then gently curled her stiff fingers around it, holding them there for a moment to make sure she understood what he was giving her. Then he touched the edge of one infant's blanket with careful fingers and felt how light the child was, how little warmth remained in that tiny body. It was like holding a bundle of sticks wrapped in cloth. In slow, deliberate English, each word chosen with care, because he knew his accent marked him as foreign, as other as something these white men might decide to eliminate. If he gave them excuse, he said, "Your children will not starve again. I swear this." The promise hung in the frozen air between them. And suddenly the wind seemed to quiet, as though the mountain itself had paused to listen. Men on the boardwalk stopped their muttering. Winifred Calder's mouth compressed into a thin, bloodless line. Deputy Foster's hand stayed on his gun knuckles, white. Chasky rose to his feet, lifting Violet with one arm beneath her shoulders and scooping the infants against his chest with the other. She was so light, it frightened him. He had carried deer carcasses that weighed more. He carried them up onto the eating house porch, his moccasins leaving dark, wet prints in the snow, and stood there facing the door as though he had every right in the world to be there. "I said off my street," Winifred hissed. But there was something uncertain in her voice now, something that had not been there before. The cook appeared in the doorway, a broad, flour-dusted man named Caleb, who had come west from Ohio and still carried the flat vowels of that place in his speech. "We don't serve beggars," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "And we sure as hell don't serve him." From somewhere inside the warm room, a rough voice cut through the tension like a knife through fat. "Then by tomorrow morning, you will have 3 dead bodies on your doorstep, and I will personally make sure that every man, woman, and child in this territory knows you let them freeze while you stood there holding a skillet." Dr. Elias Turner pushed his way through the small crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation. He was a lean, rangy man in his middle 50s, with iron-gray hair worn longer than fashion dictated and a coat so patched and mended that it was difficult to say what color it had originally been. He had the look of a man who had not slept well in years, with deep lines bracketing his mouth and shadows under his eyes that no amount of rest would erase. He took one look at the babies, at the gray cast to their skin, at the way their small chests rose and fell in rapid, shallow movements, and his expression went hard as flint. "We're a kitchen." He snapped, not asking permission, simply giving orders in the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed in matters of life and death. "Hot water, blankets, broth, and make it warm, not scalding. Move now, or we will be digging graves come morning, and I will make certain everyone knows whose fault it was." Nobody argued with a doctor when he spoke in that tone, especially not when he did it loud enough for half the street to hear. Caleb the cook stepped aside, his face flushed. Winifred Calder opened her mouth as though to protest, then closed it again and turned sharply on her heel, walking back into the hotel without another word. Reputation mattered in a place like Buffalo Gap. A dead infant on the front steps would be very bad indeed for business, and 3 dead would be catastrophic. Inside the steamy back room that served as the eating house kitchen, Violet collapsed onto a 3-legged stool near the cast-iron stove. The sudden warmth was almost painful. Her hands began to thaw, and with the thawing came a fierce burning agony that made her bite down hard on her lower lip to keep from crying out. Chaska set the infants down on a folded flour sack near the stove's warmth, not too close where they might be scorched, but close enough to begin to drive out the terrible cold that had settled into their small bones. Dr. Elias unwrapped the babies with the practiced, efficient movements of a man who had done this 1,000 times before, in 1,000 desperate circumstances. He checked their breathing, placed his fingers against the side of each tiny neck to feel the flutter of pulse beneath the skin, studied the color of their lips and the whites of their eyes. His expression gave away nothing but. Violet watched his face with the desperate intensity of someone waiting for a judge to pronounce sentence. "They are starving," he said at last, his voice flat and factual. "How long since they have eaten anything?" Violet opened her mouth to answer, but no sound came out. Her throat had closed up completely, whether from cold or grief or simple exhaustion she could not have said. She shook her head helplessly, and tears began to cut clean tracks through the grime that coated her face. Elias made an impatient noise in his throat and snapped his fingers at a thin girl who was hovering uncertainly near the door. "Marion, milk warm but not hot tested on your wrist like I showed you, and bread soaked soft in broth. Quickly now." The girl, Marion was her name, 15 years old, and orphaned, working off an indenture to Winifred Calder that still had 3 years to run, jumped as though she had been struck and scurried toward the pantry. She was a pale, hollow-eyed creature, with work-roughened hands and a habit of flinching when people moved too quickly near her. But she was also the only person in that kitchen who looked at Violet with something approaching sympathy instead of contempt. Chaske stood near the door with his arms crossed, his buffalo robe dripping melted snow onto the rough plank floor. He did not speak, but his presence was a wall between Violet and the men who still muttered and shifted their weight out in the main room. He was watching everyone and everything with the still patient attention of a hunter waiting for game to move into position. As Violet shifted her weight on the stool, trying to restore feeling to her frozen feet, something slipped from the folds of her dress and tumbled toward the slop bucket that sat on the floor beside the stove. Chaske moved without seeming to hurry, his hand shooting out with the unthinking precision of a man plucking an arrow from the air. He caught the falling object before it could land in the bucket of kitchen scraps and frozen dishwater. It was a small notebook bound in stained leather and tied shut with a leather thong. The cover was worn nearly smooth from handling, and someone had burned initials into the hide with a hot wire, E.W. Edmund Weber. Violet's husband dead now, these 3 months buried in a common grave on the hill above town, with 11 other men who had died when the mine roof fell. Chaske turned the notebook over in his hands, and as he did so, a fine residue transferred itself to his fingers. It was not quite dust and not quite powder, more like a heavy sediment that had settled into the grain of the leather. The color was distinctive pale gray, with an almost silvery sheen like tarnished metal ground to powder. It had a faint chemical smell that caught at the back of his throat, bitter and wrong. He knew that smell. He had smelled it before up at Crow Wing Creek, where the water ran strange and the fish died with their bellies to the sky. He handed the notebook back to Violet without comment. But his dark eyes met hers for a long moment, and something passed between them, some wordless understanding that this small stained object was more than a widow's keepsake, more than a dead man's scribblings. She took it from him and pressed it against her chest as though it were a talisman, her fingers white-knuckled around it. But the gray-silver residue remained on Chaske's palm, and he could feel it there, like a brand, like a warning, like the touch of something poisonous that had not yet finished its killing. Marion returned with a dented tin cup of milk that steamed faintly in the cold air, and a wooden bowl filled with torn bread soaking in beef broth. Violet took them with shaking hands and began to feed the twins one excruciating spoonful at a time. The babies sucked weakly, their small throats working with visible effort. It was not much, just a few swallows each, before they turned their heads away in exhaustion. But it was enough to keep them breathing, for now enough to pull them back from the very edge of the darkness that had been reaching for them. Dr. Elias watched in silence, his weathered face unreadable. After a moment, he glanced at the notebook still clutched in Violet's other hand, then looked at Chaska with raised eyebrows. "What is that?" he asked quietly. Violet hesitated. Her eyes darted from Elias to Chaski to the door, as though calculating whether it was safe to answer, whether these two men could be trusted, or whether trust itself was a luxury she could no longer afford. Then slowly, she loosened her grip and held the notebook out toward the doctor. Elias took it and untied the thong, opening it to the first page. His eyes began to move across the lines of neat, careful handwriting, numbers arranged in columns, dates, notations. This was not the journal of a simple laborer, not the haphazard record-keeping of an uneducated man. This was methodical, deliberate, the work of someone who understood bookkeeping and accounts. Edmund Weber had been a bookkeeper's son back in Pennsylvania, and the habit of precision had stayed with him even underground, even in the dark. Elias turned pages slowly, his frown deepening with each one. These were not personal reflections or letters to a lost love. These were records, barrels of mercury delivered to the mine with dates and quantities. Nights when tailings had been dumped into the gorge instead of the lined pit that territorial guidelines required. Small payments noted with initials beside them, C, for someone whose name began with C, P for another. And in the margins, in that same careful hand, questions Edmund had asked himself: how much reaches the creek? Children sick downstream connection. Wait, timing matters. Spring, Yanch leverage. Dr. Elias looked up slowly, his face gone pale beneath its weathering. "Your husband was keeping records," he said carefully. "Not for the mine, for himself." Violet's breath came shallow and fast. "I don't understand." "He was gathering proof," Elias said, choosing his words with the precision of a man navigating a field strewn with hidden traps. Proof of what the mine was doing. Proof of who was being paid to look the other way. And he meant to use it. Chaski stepped closer, his voice low. "Use it how?" Elias flipped to the back of the notebook, where a separate sheet had been pressed flat between the final pages. He unfolded it with careful fingers. It was a list written in that same neat hand. Demands back pay for all miners retroactive to the previous spring. Safer timbering practices in the lower galleries. A percentage 5% of the mine's gross profits to be distributed among the workers. And at the bottom of the page, a single line that made everything else clear. "Or I send 3 copies, one to the territorial paper in Raven Rock, one to the Indian agent at Fort Bridger, one to Judge Price's office." Violet stared at the paper as though it had turned into a serpent in her hands. "He was going to blackmail Ritter," she whispered, and her voice was hollow with a grief more complicated than simple loss. "Yes," Elias said gently, "and I very much suspect that is why he is dead." The words hung in the warm air of the kitchen, heavy and final. Outside, the wind howled around the eaves of the building, and somewhere in the distance, a dog was barking with the frantic, repetitive rhythm of an animal that has been left out in the cold too long. No one spoke. Violet looked down at the twins, now sleeping fitfully in their nest of borrowed blankets, and felt the weight of understanding settle onto her shoulders like a yoke. Her husband had not been a martyr. He had not been a hero standing up for his fellow workers out of principle. He had been an opportunist who saw a chance to profit from other men's suffering and had been willing to let that suffering continue until he judged the moment ripe for maximum gain. And because of that calculation, because of that delay, Lakota children had drunk poisoned water. Miners' families had sickened. Her own husband had been crushed beneath falling rock, whether by genuine accident or by Ritter's design, she would probably never know. Chaske was watching her face, and she knew he understood. She could see it in his eyes. Edmund's choices had killed his people. Not directly, perhaps, but by inaction, by waiting, by valuing silver over lives. It was a thing that could not be undone or forgiven, only acknowledged. I am not him. Violet said at last, her voice stronger than she had thought possible. I will not wait. I will not bargain. I will stop Ritter or I will die trying. But I will not let this continue. Chaske held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. Then we take this to someone who can act on it, he said. We make Ritter answer. Dr. Elias closed the notebook carefully and handed it back to Violet. You need to understand what you are proposing, he said quietly. Ritter owns this town. He pays the sheriff's salary. He employs half the men in Buffalo Gap directly or indirectly. He has money lawyers' friends in the territorial government. If you go against him with this, he will not simply let it happen. He will crush you if he can. Then he can try, Violet said and pressed the notebook against her chest once more. 3 weeks earlier, before the storm that brought Violet to her knees in the snow, before the notebook fell into unexpected hands, Chaske had ridden down from the high country with 3 kinsmen. They were Greyhawk, a man of Chaske's own age, with eyes that could spot game at impossible distances. Standing Elk, an elder, whose face was a map of old scars and older stories. And young Otter, barely 16, eager to prove himself, and still soft enough to believe that the world might be fair if a man only fought hard enough. They came because the water in Crow Wing Creek had turned wrong. It was not a dramatic change, not something a casual observer would notice in a single glance, but the people who lived along that water, who drank from it, and used it for cooking and washing, who caught fish from its pools and watched their children play along its banks, they noticed. The fish began to die, floating belly up in the shallows, with their eyes gone cloudy and strange. The beaver abandoned their lodges and dams, moving upstream to cleaner water or simply vanishing entirely. Ducks and geese that had always stopped to rest during their migrations now flew past without landing, and the children began to sicken. It started with small things. Tremors in the hands so slight that at first the mothers thought their little ones were simply cold. Sores that appeared on arms and legs and would not heal properly, weeping clear fluid that dried to a grayish crust. A persistent cough that brought up phlegm streaked with blood. One woman coughed so hard and so long that she cracked a rib, and after that she could barely draw breath without gasping in pain. The water itself looked clear enough, especially in winter when it ran beneath a skin of ice. But it tasted wrong, metallic, bitter, like biting down on a piece of old trade silver. And when the ice formed, it sometimes showed strange colors in the sunlight rainbows that had no business being there. Chaske and his companions followed the creek upstream through narrow coulees, choked with snow across frozen beaver ponds, over ridges where the wind scoured the ground bare. They followed it for 2 days, sleeping cold and eating little, until they found the source of the corruption. High on the shoulder of Black Mesa, perched like a great ugly bird on a tumble of broken rock, stood the Ritter's silver mine. Tailings spilled down the mountainside in gray-brown heaps, and from the base of those heaps seeped a slow, thick discharge of heavy gray sludge, marked with an oily metallic sheen that caught the light like tarnished silver. The sludge oozed into a ravine, and the ravine fed into Crow Wing Creek, and the creek carried the poison downstream to where people lived and children played. Chaske stood looking at that seep for a long time, his breath steaming in the cold air, and felt a deep, cold anger settle into his bones. This was not accident. This was not the work of nature or spirits or bad fortune. This was men making a choice, deciding that it was easier and cheaper to dump their waste into the gorge than to dispose of it properly, and deciding that the lives of the people downstream did not matter enough to change that practice. He took a sample of the sludge, scraping it into a small leather pouch, and they rode down to Buffalo Gap to see if there was anyone in that white man's town who might care. Klaus Ritter had arrived in Buffalo Gap 2 years earlier with money in his pockets and ambition in his heart. He was a compact, wire-muscled man in his early 40s, originally from Bremen, who spoke English with a clipped Prussian accent that some people found charming and others found grating. He dressed better than anyone else in town, tailored wool coats, polished boots, a gold watch chain that glinted when he moved. He had a habit of tapping his fingers on whatever surface was nearest when he was thinking. And he thought constantly, always calculating angles and advantages. The silver strike on Black Mesa had been modest, but real enough to justify a proper mining operation if it was managed efficiently. Ritter managed it very efficiently indeed. He cut corners on timbering because good timber was expensive and had to be hauled in from a distance. He cut corners on ventilation because sinking additional shafts cost money that could be better spent on expansion. He cut corners on waste disposal because building a proper containment system for mercury tailings would have eaten into his profit margin, and Ritter's profit margin was sacred. He also understood that a successful mine needed more than silver in the ground. It needed a town that would look the other way when looking away was convenient. Sheriff Harlan Cobb had worn a badge for 8 years, first in Kansas and now here. And he had learned that the star on his chest was only as powerful as the man who paid his salary. Ritter paid his salary along with a generous monthly bonus for discretionary expenses. Cobb was a thick-necked man with small, close-set eyes and a mouth like a knife slash. He was not particularly bright, but he was loyal to coin, and he was brutal when brutality was called for. Ritter also kept a handful of harder men on his payroll, men who handled problems that could not be solved with paperwork or bribes. The worst of them was a scarred, gap-toothed creature named Rattler Pike, so called because he had lost most of his teeth in a knife fight, and now spoke in a slithering hiss that made people's skin crawl. Rattler had no particular loyalty to anything except silver. But silver was enough. He broke bones when Ritter asked him to break bones. He started fires when fires needed starting. He made people disappear when disappearing was the best solution. Violet Weber had come to Buffalo Gap in late September of 1854, riding in the last wagon train of the season with her husband Edmund and their few possessions bundled in a canvas sack. They were running from nothing in particular and toward nothing specific, just the vague Western promise of steady work and a fresh start that had lured so many others into the territories. They had seen a poster tacked to the wall of a church back in Pennsylvania. Good wages, sound, timbering, steady work in the territories. Inquire at Ritter Mining Concern, Buffalo Gap. The poster had shown a handsome sketch of mountains and opportunity. It had not shown the reality of Buffalo Gap, which was a collection of rough buildings crouched in the cold shadow of Black Mesa, populated by desperate men, and a few even more desperate women. Edmund had been a cautious man, the son of a bookkeeper educated enough to read and write in cipher. He took a job in the mine, working the lower gallery, where the richest veins ran, but where the rock overhead was fractured and unstable. He kept his head down and did his work and observed everything with the careful attention of a man who understood that information was valuable. He noticed things. He noticed when barrels marked "Mercury Handle with Care" were delivered to the mine in quantities that did not match the official records. He noticed when the work crews were sent out at night to dump barrels of waste into the gorge instead of the lined containment pit. He noticed when Sheriff Cobb visited Ritter's office and left with his pockets heavier than when he had arrived. And Edmund, being a bookkeeper's son, wrote it all down. 3 days before the collapse, Marion, who was too insignificant for anyone to notice, and who heard everything because of it, was sweeping the floor outside Ritter's office when she heard voices raised in argument. One voice was Ritter's, sharp and cold. The other was Edmund Weber's, lower and more cautious, but insistent. "The men are getting sick," Edmund said. "Children downstream are getting sick. I know what is causing it. I know what you are dumping." "What you know," Ritter replied, "and what you can prove are two different things, Weber. And even if you could prove it, who would you tell the territorial government? They are 300 miles away, and they do not care about a few sick Indians. The sheriff, he works for me. The mine inspector. There is no mine inspector. You have no leverage here." "Maybe not yet," Edmund said. "But I am watching, and I am writing things down." There was a long silence. Then Ritter's voice, very quiet and very cold. "Then I suggest you be careful where you walk, Weber. Accidents happen underground." 3 weeks later, the roof of the lower gallery came down during shift change. 12 men died beneath rock and splintered timber. Edmund Weber was one of them. Ritter called it an unfortunate accident, paid for simple coffins, and had the bodies buried in a common grave. By the time Violet Weber, 6 months pregnant with twins, learned of her husband's death, Edmund was already in the ground, and the mine was already working again, and the debris cleared the gallery, sealed off the whole incident, filed away as one of those tragic but inevitable occurrences that happen when men dig into mountains. Violet gave birth 2 weeks later alone, except for Marion, who had seen her own mother die in childbirth, and who therefore knew at least the basic mechanics of what needed to happen. The twins were small and sickly from the start, born too soon and too light. And they cried with thin, reedy voices that seemed to fade a little more each day. Winifred Calder allowed Violet to stay in the boarding house on credit, but the credit had limits, and those limits had been reached weeks ago. By the middle of January, Violet had sold everything she owned except the clothes she wore, the blankets that wrapped her children, and Edmund's notebook, which she carried everywhere because it was the only thing she had left that still smelled faintly of her husband, tobacco and ink and sweat. Winter closed around Buffalo Gap like a fist. The supply wagons from Raven Rock stopped running when the pass filled with snow. Prices for everything climbed. Flour that had cost $2 for a 50-pound sack in October now cost $7, and that was if you could find any. The butcher hung a sign that read, "No credit, no exceptions." Men drank more and fought in the streets. Women went hungry so their children could eat, and then the children went hungry too. Dr. Elias Turner rode himself close to death, trying to keep up with the sickness that spread through the territory like slow fire. He was not a young man anymore, and every year the winters seemed harder and the sickness more persistent. He treated white homesteaders and Lakota families with the same rough competence, because to Elias, a body was a body, and suffering was suffering, that he had long ago stopped believing that God made distinctions between races when it came to pain. He began to see patterns. The tremors, the sores that would not heal, the respiratory distress that left children gasping like landed fish. He had seen mercury poisoning before years ago in California, where the hydraulic mining operations had turned whole valleys into toxic wastelands. He knew what it looked like. He knew what it did to the human body over time, how it accumulated in tissue, how it attacked the nervous system, how it killed slowly and inevitably, unless the exposure was stopped. He had gone to Sheriff Cobb with his suspicions, once carrying his journal of cases, his notes on symptoms, and their geographic distribution. Cobb had listened with a face like stone, and then told Elias to stick to setting bones and leave the mines business to men who understood economics. The conversation had ended there, and Elias had understood that taking his concerns any further would be dangerous. But he kept his journal. He kept taking notes. And he kept riding between the white homesteads and the Lakota camps, documenting everything, waiting for the moment when documentation might become weapon. The morning after Chasky carried Violet and her children into the eating house kitchen after the twins had been fed and warmed and put to sleep in a nest of blankets near the stove, Violet and Chasky and Dr. Elias made their way up the frozen street to the mine office. The office was a square building with plank walls and a tin roof perched on the hillside above the main shaft entrance. Smoke poured from a crooked stovepipe, and through the single window they could see the glow of lamplight. Ritter conducted his business here, away from the noise and filth of the actual mining operation, in a room where the air was warm and the furnishings were better than anything else in Buffalo Gap. When they pushed through the door, Elias first, then Violet, then Chasky bringing up the rear, they found Ritter sitting behind a large desk covered with papers and ore samples and a half-empty bottle of brandy. Sheriff Cobb stood by the window with his arms crossed, his badge catching the lamplight. Two of Ritter's men lounged near the stove, hard-faced and watchful. Ritter looked up with an expression of mild irritation, as though they were traveling salesmen who had called at an inconvenient hour. "Mrs. Weber," he said, not standing. "Dr. Turner, and our noble savage. To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" Violet stepped forward and placed Edmund's notebook on the desk with a solid thump. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "This belonged to my husband, belonged to my... He kept records of what you have been doing. Mercury deliveries that do not match your official reports. Midnight dumps into the gorge. Payments to men who were supposed to be enforcing territorial law. Everything is in here." Ritter picked up the notebook and began to page through it slowly, his expression unchanging. Cobb shifted his weight by the window, his hand dropping casually to rest on the butt of his revolver. The two guards by the stove straightened up suddenly, more alert. "This is nothing but a dead man's scratchings," Ritter said after a long moment, setting the notebook down. "Figures without context. If your husband wrote down numbers, that does not mean he understood what they represented. Men who work underground are often confused." Dr. Elias stepped forward, his voice hard. "Those numbers match exactly the patterns of sickness I have been documenting for the past 8 months. Mercury poisoning Mr. Ritter in the Lakota camp downstream and in the white homesteads that draw water from the creek. If a territorial judge sees this notebook alongside my medical records, he will understand what it means." Ritter's eyes sharpened. He leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers beneath his chin, studying them with the calm, calculating gaze of a man working through a problem. "Judges are very expensive," he said softly. "I can afford judges, Mrs. Weber. Can you? You have debts. You have 2 infant children to feed. I might be persuaded to cancel your debt to Mrs. Calder. I might even be persuaded to offer you a modest settlement for your husband's unfortunate death. All you need to do is hand me that notebook and agree that this matter is closed." Violet's hands clenched into fists at her sides. When she spoke, her voice shook but did not break. "My husband died in your mine. He died for your silver. You will not buy him twice." Ritter's expression did not change, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Then you are a fool," he said. "And fools do not last long in places like this." Sheriff Cobb took a step forward, his hand now resting openly on his revolver. The 2 guards moved away from the stove, spreading out to block the door. The room suddenly felt much smaller, the air much heavier. "You need to leave," Cobb said, his voice flat. "All 3 of you. Now." Chasky had been standing silently near the door, watching everything with that same patient, predatory stillness. Now he spoke for the first time, his English slow and deliberate. "We came to talk, not to fight. But we will not be threatened." One of the guards, a thick-shouldered man with a broken nose, stepped toward Chasky with a length of hickory axe handle in his hand. Nobody asked what you will or will not do, Indian. The man swung the axe handle in a short, vicious arc aimed at Chaska's ribs. Chaska caught the blow on his forearm. There was a meaty smack of wood against muscle. And then he was moving faster than a man that size should have been able to move. His hand closed on the guard's wrist and twisted, and there was an audible crack. The guard screamed and dropped the axe handle. Chaska shoved him backward into the wall hard enough to knock the wind out of him. The second guard pulled a knife, but Dr. Elias grabbed Violet's arm and yanked her toward the door. "Out!" he hissed. "Now!" Chaska backed after them, his eyes never leaving Cobb's gun. The sheriff had drawn the revolver, now a big Colt Dragoon that looked like a cannon in the lamplight, and he was pointing it directly at Chaska's chest. "One more step and I will put you down like a dog," Cobb said. They went out into the cold, the door slamming shut behind them. Violet stumbled on the icy path and nearly fell. But Chaska caught her elbow and steadied her. Dr. Elias was breathing hard, his face gray. Chaska's forearm was already beginning to swell where the axe handle had struck it. And when he moved his fingers experimentally, pain lanced up his arm. Not broken, but badly bruised. Behind them, the door of the office opened again. Ritter stood framed in the lamplight, his face composed and calm. "You have until tomorrow night," he called after them. "Bring me that notebook, Mrs. Weber, or I will take it. And I promise you will regret making this difficult." They walked down the hill in silence, their boots crunching in the snow, their breath steaming. The notebook was still clutched in Violet's hand, but they had accomplished nothing except to make themselves targets. And in Buffalo Gap, as Violet was beginning to understand, targets did not last long. That night they gathered in the loft above Anton Novak's livery stable. Anton was a quiet, slope-shouldered Bohemian farmer who had come west to escape conscription in the old country, and who asked no questions when Elias requested the use of his loft for a few hours. The space was drafty and smelled of hay and horses, but it was private, and it was out of sight. The twins slept in their nest of blankets, their breathing finely steady and regular. Violet sat on an overturned crate with the notebook open on her knees, studying Edmund's handwriting by the light of a single candle. Chaska sat cross-legged on the floor, wrapping his bruised forearm in a strip of cloth. Elias paced back and forth, his shadow huge and restless on the slanted ceiling. "We need more than the notebook," Elias said quietly. "We need physical evidence. Water samples from the creek showing contamination. Medical records documenting the pattern of illness. Testimony from the Lakota families who have been affected. If we can assemble a complete case, something too substantial to ignore or dismiss, then maybe we can get a territorial judge to act." "And how do we get that to a judge?" Violet asked. "Ritter owns the sheriff. He probably owns half the territorial government. Who is going to listen to us?" "Judge Bartholomew Price," Elias said. "He rides circuit through this region twice a year, and he has a reputation for being honest. More importantly, he has a reputation for being ambitious. If we can present him with a case that is both solid and sensational, mercury poisoning dead children, criminal conspiracy, he will not be able to resist the opportunity to make a name for himself. But we need evidence he cannot ignore." Chaska looked up from his bandaging. "The water at Crow Wing Creek is fouled. I have seen it. I can take you there, show you where the poison enters. We can collect samples. We can speak to the families. Then we leave at first light," Elias said. "We ride to the Lakota camp, we document everything we can, and then we get copies of all this evidence to Judge Price in Raven Rock before Ritter can stop us." They left before dawn, when the sky was still black and the stars were bright and hard as chips of ice. Elias and Chaska rode out together on two of Anton's horses, sturdy, patient animals accustomed to hard work. Violet stayed behind with the twins, hidden in the loft with a borrowed revolver in her lap, and instructions to shoot anyone who came up the ladder uninvited. The ride to Crow Wing Creek took most of the day. The temperature never rose above zero, and the wind that came off the peaks was brutal. They followed the creek upstream past frozen beaver ponds and through coulees where the snow lay in drifts deep enough to swallow a horse. Chasky led the way, reading the land with the unconscious ease of a man who had spent his whole life in it. Where the creek ran through the Lakota winter camp, they found families huddled in lodges, heavy with frost, the smoke from their fires rising straight up in the still air. The children who came out to watch them pass had the same symptoms Elias had been documenting: trembling hands, sores on their arms and legs, a persistent cough that sounded like tearing cloth. Chasky spoke to them in Lakota, explaining what they were trying to do. The elders listened with faces that showed little hope, but also little surprise. They had lived long enough to know that promises from white men were worth less than smoke. But they brought out their sick children anyway, because what else could they do? Let them die in silence. Elias examined each child with patient thoroughness, writing down names and ages and symptoms in his journal. He asked questions through Chasky, who translated about when the sickness had started, whether anyone had noticed changes in the water, whether any adults had been affected. The answers fit the pattern he had been seeing, and the sickness had begun in the late summer, when the mine had expanded its operations and increased its output. The water had changed taste around the same time. Several adults had tremors and respiratory problems, though not as severe as the children. While Elias worked, Chasky walked down to the creek with a leather pouch and a collection of glass bottles Anton had provided. Where the ice had broken away, the water ran dark and sluggish, and on the surface floated a thin, iridescent sheen like oil, but with a heavier, more metallic character. He used a stick to break through the ice in several places and collected samples of the water beneath, sealing each bottle with a cork and marking it with a strip of cloth. On the way back to Buffalo Gap, disaster found them. They were crossing a side channel of the creek, a place where the ice should have been thick and safe this late in the season. But Elias's horse, a mare named Belle, who had carried him faithfully for 5 years, put her hoof through a thin spot that should not have been there. The ice gave way with a sound like breaking glass. Belle screamed a horrible, terrified sound and went down sideways, throwing Elias forward onto the ice. The ice cracked beneath him in jagged spider lines. He could feel it shifting, feel the black water surging beneath. He scrabbled for purchase, but his gloved hands found nothing to grip. He was sliding toward the hole, toward the water that would kill him in minutes if he went under, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Then Chasky was there, moving faster than thought, throwing himself flat on the ice and belly sliding forward like a seal until he could grab Elias by the collar of his coat. The doctor's weight and momentum were pulling them both toward the hole. Chasky dug the toes of his moccasins into the ice, feeling his ribs scream in protest from the earlier blow, and pulled with everything he had. They slid backward inch by agonizing inch until they reached solid ice. Behind them, Belle went under with a final thrash of hooves disappearing into the black water, as though she had never been. The current took her, and she did not surface again. They lay on the ice for a long moment, gasping, soaked to the skin, and already beginning to freeze. Then they got up and staggered to Chasky's horse, which was dancing and snorting with fear 20 yards away. They rode double back to Buffalo Gap with Elias shaking so hard his teeth rattled, and Chasky's ribs sending sharp stabs of pain through his chest with every breath. But the samples were safe. The journal was safe. They had what they needed. 3 days later, before they could send the evidence to Judge Price, the ambush came. Elias rode alone toward the telegraph station at Sandbar, a half-day's journey across open prairie. He carried the samples, the journal, and carefully copied pages from Edmund's notebook, all packed in his saddlebags. He carried them alone because they had agreed it was safer that way. One rider drew less attention than 3. And if anything happened to him, Violet and Chaske would still have the original notebook. The riders came out of a dry wash like wolves out of a den. There were 4 of them, masked with bandanas, speaking in low, muffled voices that might have belonged to anyone. They surrounded Elias, grabbed his horse's reins, and pulled him from the saddle. He hit the frozen ground hard enough to drive the air from his lungs, and before he could rise, they were on him. They did not ask questions. They did not threaten. They simply took his saddlebags and began systematically destroying everything inside. The glass bottles were smashed with rifle butts, the water and ice ground into the dirt. The pages from the notebook were scattered into the wind, white squares, tumbling across the prairie like wounded birds. The journal was torn in half and thrown into a frozen creek. Then they beat him methodical and thorough, using boots and fists and rifle stocks. They broke his left leg with a deliberate stomp just above the knee. Elias heard the bones snap and felt a wave of nausea so intense he vomited into the snow. They left him in a dry arroyo, half-conscious, bleeding from a dozen places, his face already swelling beyond recognition. They took his horse, but left him breathing. Dead men prompted investigations. Injured men just looked like they had been unlucky. A ranch boy found him by pure chance 6 hours later, following the sound of his groans. The boy rode hard to Buffalo Gap and found Chaske at Anton's livery. By the time Chaske reached Elias, the doctor was in shock, his lips blue, his pulse thready and weak. Getting him back to town was a nightmare. Chaske tore a fence rail from a nearby homestead and lashed Elias to it with rope, then dragged the makeshift sled across the frozen ground, every jolt sending fresh agony through both men, through Elias's shattered leg, and through Chaske's battered ribs. By the time they reached Buffalo Gap, Chaske was coughing blood, and Elias was unconscious. They put the doctor in his own surgery on the same table where he had set bones and stitched wounds and delivered babies. Marion and Violet tended him as best they could, following the instructions he had written down years before for cases where he might not be able to tend himself. They splinted his leg, cleaned his wounds, wrapped him in every blanket they could find. He woke 2 days later, feverish and incoherent, calling for water samples that no longer existed. While Elias lay broken and helpless, Violet sat in the cold loft and forced herself to read Edmund's notebook again, page by page, word by word. She had read it before, but she had not truly understood what she was reading. Now she looked at it with new eyes that had seen her husband not as a victim, but as a calculating opportunist. The evidence was there, written in Edmund's own hand. The underlined amounts, the notations about timing and leverage, the list of demands folded and hidden in the back, the marginal notes that made his intentions clear. Wait for spring, more leverage then. If necessary, threaten both the paper and the Indian agent. Double pressure. Edmund had known about the poisoning. He had documented it with meticulous care, and he had sat on that documentation, waiting for the moment when he could extract maximum value from it, while children downstream drank tainted water, and miners worked in unsafe conditions, and Klaus Ritter grew richer by the day. Her husband had not been a hero. He had been a blackmailer willing to let suffering continue until he judged the moment ripe for his demands. When Violet showed the pages to Chaske, when she finally let him see the full truth of what Edmund had planned, he read them in silence, his face unreadable. Then he looked up at her, and his eyes held something complicated and painful. Not quite accusation, but not quite forgiveness either. "Your husband chose to wait," Chaske said quietly, "while my people's children died." The words were not spoken in anger. They were simply the truth laid bare between them. And Violet, who had spent months drowning in grief for a man she thought she knew, felt that grief twist into something harder and more bitter. "I am not him," she said, and her voice was fierce, now burning with a determination that surprised her. "I will not wait. I will not bargain. I will not let another child die while I calculate advantage. We stop Ritter now, whatever it costs." Chaska held her gaze for a long moment. Then slowly, he nodded. "Together," he said. "We stop him together." But something had changed between them. Some easy trust had been complicated by the knowledge of Edmund's choices. They would work together, yes. They would fight together. But the shadow of her husband's greed lay across their alliance now, and both of them felt it. As January turned to February, the hungry time came to Buffalo Gap. The supply wagons that should have arrived from Raven Rock never appeared. Word filtered back through a lone rider that one wagon had overturned on the mountain road, spilling its entire load into a ravine too steep to climb down into. Flour beans, salt pork, sugar coffee. All of it lay scattered across rocks and snow, unreachable until spring. The other wagons had turned back rather than risk the same fate. The stores in town ran dry within days. The butcher's shop, which had shown a few pathetic cuts of meat in the window, went bare. The dry goods store closed its doors, except for an hour in the morning, when the proprietor would sell what little he had at prices that made people curse and weep. Flour that had been $7 for 50 pounds was now 15, then 20 then, simply unavailable at any price. Families tightened belts that were already drawn tight. Women who had been giving their own portions to their children began to give more until they were eating almost nothing and growing gaunt as winter deer. Children cried at night, not from cold now, but from the gnawing emptiness in their bellies. Old people who needed less food but also had less strength to endure privation began to die quietly in their beds. The Lakota camp on Crow Wing Creek fared no better. The hunting had been poor all winter. The deer had moved south earlier than usual, and the elk had retreated deep into the high country where the snow made tracking them almost impossible. The fish that might have supplemented their stores were gone, killed by the poisoned water. They were living on roots and old pemmican and the memory of better seasons. Dr. Elias, propped up on his bed with his splinted leg elevated, felt the hunger spreading through the town like a disease and could do nothing about it. He had no medicine to ease hunger. He had no words that would conjure food from empty air. He could only watch as people he had known for years began to waste away, their faces growing hollow, their eyes sinking into dark sockets. Marion, who slept in a cupboard off the eating house kitchen, and whose indenture gave her rights to food as part of her contract, began to steal. She stole scraps of bread and half-rotten vegetables from the waste bucket. She stole the burnt crusts that stuck to baking pans. She stole a tin of lard that Winifred had been saving, replacing it with water colored with ash to disguise the theft for a few days. She brought these pathetic offerings to the loft where Violet and the twins were hiding. And she wept while Violet thanked her, because they both knew that Marion was risking a brutal beating if she was caught, and they both knew that Violet had no choice but to accept the stolen food because her children were starving. Anton Novak killed one of his 3 milk cows, an old animal who had stopped giving much milk and was eating fodder he could not afford to spare. He butchered her himself and divided the meat into small portions, which he distributed to families with young children, asking nothing in return. When his eldest daughter asked why he was giving away food when they themselves were hungry, Anton looked at her with the patient weariness of a man who had seen starvation before, and said in his broken English, "If we eat while children die, we are not people anymore. We are just animals." And in the midst of the hunger, Klaus Ritter saw an opportunity. He called a town meeting on a bitter evening in mid-February, when the wind was screaming down from Black Mesa, and the few people who ventured out wrapped themselves in every scrap of cloth they owned. The meeting was held in the drafty hall that served as church, school, and gathering place, and Ritter had arranged for several kegs of whiskey to be available. Cheap, harsh whiskey that burned going down, but warmed the belly and loosened tongues. The hall filled slowly, Miners came, their faces gaunt and desperate. Freighters came, worried about their livelihoods if the town died. Storekeepers came, shopkeepers, a few ranchers from the surrounding country. The women stayed home, mostly because women with hungry children did not leave those children to attend political meetings. Ritter stood on a raised platform at the front of the hall, lamplight throwing shadows across his face. He waited until the room was full and the whiskey was flowing, and then he began to speak. He spoke about the hardship they were all enduring. He spoke about the need to pull together as a community. He spoke about outside agitators who were spreading lies about the mine, trying to shut down the only source of employment that kept Buffalo Gap alive. He spoke about the Lakota who were supposedly stealing cattle from the ranches, though no one could actually point to specific instances of theft. He spoke about a conspiracy to destroy the town, to drive out the white settlers to reclaim the land for the savages. And he spoke about Chaska. There is a man among us, Ritter said, his voice rising, who calls himself a friend to the downtrodden, who pretends to care about sick children and poisoned water. But what he really wants is to see this town fail, to see you and your family starve, to see the mine close and the jobs disappear. He hides behind a desperate widow and a crippled doctor, but make no mistake, he is the one pulling the strings. He is clever, this savage, more clever than most of his kind, and he is dangerous. Men muttered in the audience. Hands tightened around tin cups of whiskey. The hunger had made people desperate, and desperate people looked for someone to blame. If we do not act, Ritter continued, if we allow this agitation to continue, the mine will close. The territorial government will step in. They will shut us down based on lies and hearsay, and all of you will be out of work. Your families will starve for certain then. Is that what you want? No, someone shouted from the back. Then we need to send a message, Ritter said. We need to make it clear that Buffalo Gap does not tolerate troublemakers. We need to handle this ourselves as men before the government does it for us. The muttering grew louder. Someone said the word rope. Someone else said burn. The whiskey was working, and the hunger was working, and Ritter's words were working. The room was beginning to turn into a mob. At the back of the hall, Timberjack Jensen stood with his arms crossed, listening to it all with a face like stone. Jack had been Cobb's deputy for 3 years, and in that time he had done things he was not proud of, looked the other way, when he should have looked close, kept his mouth shut when he should have spoken up. He had done these things because he needed the job, because he had grown up poor and knew what it meant to be hungry, and he had told himself that keeping his head down and his badge polished was just being practical. But listening to Ritter whip these hungry, desperate men into a lynch mob, Jack felt something cold and hard settle into his chest. He heard Ritter murmur to Cobb, not quite quietly enough, that once the Indian is in the ground and that damned notebook is ashes, everything would settle down and they could get back to business as usual. Jack had a sister back in Missouri. She had 2 children. He thought about those children going hungry while rich men played games with their lives, and he thought about what kind of man he wanted to be. And he made a decision. That night, Sheriff Cobb and 2 of his deputies found Chaska near Anton's livery. They came at him from behind, in the dark, with clubs and fists and boots. A blow to the back of the head dropped Chaska to his knees in the snow before he could turn around. Then they were on him, beating him with the methodical efficiency of men who had done this kind of work before. When Chaska woke, he was in the jail, in the single cell that Buffalo Gap possessed. His head was pounding, his vision was blurred, and every breath sent sharp knives of pain through his ribs. His hands were shackled to an iron ring set into the wall, and through the single barred window, he could see the shed behind the jail, where a noose had been hung from a rafter, swaying slightly in the wind. The charge, Cobb informed him with a smile, was horse theft. Someone had reported seeing Chaska riding a horse that belonged to the mine Cobb's own spare mount, in fact the one Violet had borrowed during the rescue. It was a bald lie, but it was a useful lie. And in Buffalo Gap, the difference between truth and usefulness had long since ceased to matter. The next morning, Cobb climbed the stairs to Winifred Calder's boarding house and knocked on the door of Violet's room with the butt of his revolver. When Violet opened it, the twins asleep behind her, wrapped in blankets so thin they might as well have been cobwebs, Cobb looked at her with eyes as cold and dead as a snake's. "You have until sundown tomorrow," he said. "You bring me that notebook your husband wrote, and you bring it to Ritter's office. You do that and maybe your Indian friend gets to see another sunrise. You don't, and he meets with an unfortunate accident. Awful lot of accidents happen when prisoners try to escape." He left without waiting for an answer, his boots heavy on the stairs. Violet stood in the doorway, shaking her heart, hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. She looked at the twins, at their small, innocent faces, and felt the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. The notebook was the only real evidence they had left. Without it, Ritter would win. The poisoning would continue. More children would die, hers among them eventually. But without Chaska, she had no allies, no strength, no realistic hope of survival through the rest of the winter. She was still standing there, frozen with indecision, when a soft knock came at the door an hour later. Winifred Calder stood in the hallway, a shawl wrapped around her thin shoulders, a candle in one hand. For a long moment, the two women looked at each other, the desperate widow and the hard landlady who had turned her out into the snow. Then Winifred stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "You think I do not remember what it is to be helpless," Winifred said quietly, and her voice was different now, stripped of its usual cutting edge. "My boy was 12 years old when the bandits came. They shot my husband first, then turned their guns on us. I begged them. I begged every man who rode past while my boy bled out in my arms. Not one of them stopped them, not one." She drew something from her pocket, a small iron key, dark with age. "I swore I would never be that helpless again," Winifred continued. "I swore I would never depend on any man's mercy. But I also swore I would never be one of the riders who looked away." She placed the key on the table between them. Beside it, she laid a scrap of paper covered with Dr. Elias's shaky handwriting instructions for how to slip the pin on the jail's back door, where Cobb kept the spare cell key, and how to avoid the squeaky board in the hallway. Violet stared at the key, her throat too tight to speak. "I cannot do this for you," Winifred said. "If I am caught helping, Ritter will destroy me. But I can give you the means to do it yourself. What you do with that is your own choice." She turned and left without another word, pulling the door shut behind her. Violet stood looking at the key for a long time. Then she hid the twins in a place she had prepared, a hidden space behind the false back of a storage cabinet in the eating house kitchen, where Marion had made a nest of blankets and promised to keep watch. She checked the chambers of Edmund's old revolver, a Colt pocket model that held 5 shots. She tucked the notebook inside her coat, and she walked out into the frozen night toward the jail, her breath steaming and her hands steady despite the fear that threatened to swallow her whole. She did not go to the back door immediately. First, she went to the livery, to the pile of hay and old wood that Anton kept stacked against the side wall. She poured lamp oil over it, oil she had taken from the kitchen oil that was meant for cooking, but that would serve a different purpose tonight. She struck a match and touched it to the oil-soaked hay. The flames caught and spread with satisfying speed, yellow and roaring. Violet ran, then her skirts heavy with snow, back toward the jail. She pressed herself into the shadows of the building just as the first shout went up. "Fire, fire at the livery!" Men poured out of buildings, Cobb among them, cursing and shouting orders. He ran toward the flames with 2 of his deputies, leaving the jail unattended. Violet waited, counting her heartbeats, until she was sure they were fully occupied with the fire, and then she slipped around to the back door. The pin came out easily, just as Elias's note had said it would. The door opened with a soft creak. Inside, the jail was empty. Cobb had not bothered to leave a guard, confident that the shackles and the locked cell would be enough. The cell key hung on a nail behind the desk, exactly where it was supposed to be. Violet took it with shaking fingers and crossed to the cell. Chasky was sitting on the narrow cot, his face bruised purple and yellow in the lamplight. When he saw her, his eyes widened in alarm. "You should not be here," he whispered. Neither should you," Violet said, unlocking the door. "Can you walk?" "I can run if I have to," Chasky said, though the way he moved suggested that running would be agony. They went out the back way into the maze of alleys and shacks that made up the lower part of Buffalo Gap. Behind them, the fire at the livery was being brought under control. The men had formed a bucket line, and Anton was shouting that the horses were safe. It would be minutes, maybe only seconds, before Cobb returned to the jail and discovered his prisoner gone. They took 2 horses that Violet had arranged earlier, Cobb's spare mount, the one he had accused Chasky of stealing, because there was a grim satisfaction in actually stealing it now, and Anton's sway-backed mule. They loaded a small sled with supplies that Violet had hidden over the past 2 days, a lantern rope, a sack of cornmeal Anton had given her, and Edmund's notebook wrapped in oilcloth. Then they rode for the mine into the teeth of a new storm that was rolling down from Black Mesa, because they both understood that this was the end now. There would be no more running, no more hiding, no more waiting for someone else to act. Either they would force the truth into the light, or they would die trying. The storm hit with full fury as they climbed the narrow trail up Black Mesa. Snow came down so thick it was like riding through a white curtain, and the wind howled with a voice that sounded almost human. The temperature plunged. Ice formed on their eyebrows and lashes, making it hard to see. The horses struggled through drifts that came up to their chests, snorting and blowing their breath, steaming in great clouds. Halfway up the trail, Violet's horse Cobb's bay spooked at something invisible in the storm. The animal reared hooves, pawing the air, and for a terrible moment, Violet felt herself sliding backward, felt the emptiness of the drop behind her. Below 100 feet down, rocks and broken ice waited to break her body into pieces. Then Chasky was there, grabbing the bay's reins with both hands, ignoring the fire in his ribs and the way his head spun from the earlier beating. He pulled the horse's head down, speaking in Lakota, his voice low and steady, and somehow audible even through the shriek of the wind. The horse calmed, trembling foam at its mouth. Violet slid down from the saddle on legs that shook so badly she could barely stand. Chasky dismounted as well, and for a moment they stood close together in the howling whiteness, the only solid things in a world that seemed to be dissolving around them. "We are close," Chasky set his lips near her ear so she could hear him. "Just a little farther." They led the horses the rest of the way, climbing on foot through snow that dragged at their legs like cold hands trying to pull them down. When the dark mouth of the mine finally appeared through the storm, Violet felt a wash of relief so intense it was almost painful. But they were not alone. Lanterns flickered through the snow ahead, a constellation of yellow lights that marked where men were gathered. As Violet and Chasky drew closer, they saw perhaps 20 men clustered around the mine entrance, some holding torches that guttered and smoked in the wind, others with rifles or clubs or coils of rope. They were miners and guards and desperate townsmen, many of them drunk or close to it, their faces flushed despite the cold. And standing on a wooden crate so he could be seen and heard was Klaus Ritter. A rough gallows had been rigged from the loading frame that stood over the mine entrance, a beam extending out over empty air, a noose swaying in the wind. The message was clear and crude. This was where justice would be dispensed tonight. Frontier justice, the kind that came from whiskey and hunger and a rich man's manipulation. Timberjack stood off to one side, his face grim, his hand resting on his holstered revolver but not drawing it. Not yet. He was waiting, watching, trying to calculate when and how to act. "There they are," someone shouted, pointing. "Horse thief and the woman." Ritter turned, his face twisted with something that might have been triumph or might have been desperation. It was hard to say which. "That woman is carrying stolen property," he shouted over the wind, his accent thickening with emotion. "Company documents that she has no right to possess. She and her Indian accomplice mean to destroy this town, to close the mine, to see all of you starve in the snow. Will you let that happen?" Men muttered and shifted. Some looked uncertain. Others looked eager for violence, eager for someone to punish, because punishment felt like action, and action felt better than helplessness. Violet stepped forward, her legs shaking, but her voice steady. She pulled the notebook from her coat and held it high where everyone could see it in the lamplight. "This mine is already destroying the town," she shouted back. "It is poisoning the water. It is killing children. My husband wrote down the proof, every barrel of mercury dumped into the creek, every payment made to keep men silent. He wrote it down because he meant to blackmail Mr. Ritter with it. That is the truth. That is why Edmund died. Not in an accident, in a murder." The crowd went quiet at the only sound, the howl of the wind and the crackling of torches. Men looked at each other, uncertain now. Several of them had known Edmund Weber, had worked beside him, had heard him talking about problems at the mine in the days before the collapse. Rattler Pike stood near the front of the crowd, his gap-toothed face twisted with confusion and something that might have been grief. He had lost a sister to the sickness, a girl of 12 who had coughed herself to death over the course of 6 weeks. He had been told it was bad luck, winter fever, nothing that could be prevented. Now he was learning it might have been something else. "You are lying," Ritter said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "You are inventing a conspiracy to save yourself." "Then let a judge read the notebook," Violet said. "Let him decide." "There will be no judge," Ritter snarled. He turned to Cobb, who stood near the mine entrance with his hand on his gun. "Arrest her. Arrest them both. They are trespassing on company property." But Cobb hesitated, and in that hesitation, Ritter saw his control beginning to slip. He jumped down from the crate and strode to the mine entrance, where crates of blasting supplies were stacked under a tarpaulin. He threw back the tarpaulin and grabbed a cloth-wrapped bundle. When he unwrapped it, everyone could see what he was holding: small kegs of black powder, the kind used for blasting, along with coils of fuse and waterproofed matches. "If there is no mine," Ritter shouted, his voice cracking now, high and desperate, "there is no evidence, no case. No judge will ride out here for rubble and rumors." He turned and ran into the mine entrance, clutching the powder keg against his chest, like a child clutching a toy. For a moment, no one moved. Then Timberjack cursed, "Blast it all to hell," and ran after him. Chaske followed without hesitation, and Violet started to follow as well, but one of the miners grabbed her arm. "You stay here, missus," he said, not unkindly. "This is no place for—" The rest of his sentence was drowned out by a gunshot from inside the mine. Inside the tunnel, the darkness was absolute, except for the single lantern Ritter carried. The air was cold and damp, and the timbers that held up the roof creaked and groaned like the ribs of some great dying beast. Ice glistened on the walls, and the floor was slick with frozen mud. Ritter ran deeper into the mine, toward the lower gallery where the collapse had occurred 3 months earlier. The gallery had been sealed off with a makeshift wall of timber and broken rock, but everyone knew what lay behind that wall, and the bodies of 12 men including Edmund Weber, crushed beneath tons of stone because the timbering had been rotten and the safety margins criminally narrow. Ritter meant to seal it all for good, to bury the evidence and the body so deep that no one would ever be able to prove anything. He set the powder keg down in a side pocket near the sealed gallery and began to uncoil the fuse, his hands shaking. Behind him, he heard footsteps running, voices shouting. He struck a match, but it went out in the damp air. He struck another, cursing in German. Timber Jack came around the corner first, his revolver drawn. "Ritter, stop. You will bring the whole mountain down on our heads. Then we all die together." Ritter set his voice high and wild. "Better that than a rope." Chasky came next, moving fast despite his injuries, and he did not bother with words. He simply lowered his shoulder and drove into Ritter like a battering ram, knocking the smaller man away from the powder keg. They went down together in the mud, grappling Ritter's lantern, spinning away and nearly going out. The match in Ritter's hand fell. It tumbled through the air, still burning, and landed in a scatter of loose black powder that had spilled from the keg. The powder caught with a hiss and a flare of light. "Fuse is lit." Timber Jack yelled, his voice echoing off the walls. "Out, move now." They scrambled toward the entrance boots, slipping on the icy floor, shoulders slamming into timber supports in their haste. Behind them, the fuse burned with a sputtering, spitting light, racing toward the keg like a snake made of fire. At the mine entrance, one of the guards, a panicked young man who had been drinking too much and was already terrified, saw shapes moving fast in the darkness. He raised his rifle and fired without thinking, the muzzle flash bright as lightning. The ball ricocheted off the stone wall and punched through one of the other powder kegs stacked near the entrance, the one Ritter had pulled the first keg from. The powder inside ignited not with a slow fuse, but all at once, and the world exploded into fire and thunder. The blast picked up men and threw them like rag dolls. Rock and timber and bodies flew through the air in a wave of heat and light and deafening sound. Violet was knocked flat on her back, her ears ringing, her vision blurred. When she could see again, the mine entrance was gone. Just a smoking, rubble-choked wound in the hillside timbers jutting out at broken angles. Men lay scattered in the snow, some groaning, some not moving at all. The smell of burned powder and scorched rock filled the air. Violet staggered to her feet, calling Chasky's name, but she could not hear her own voice over the ringing in her ears. She stumbled toward the wreckage, toward the place where she had last seen him, and nearly fell into a crack that had opened in the ground, a fissure a foot wide, running like a lightning bolt down the hillside. Then she saw him. Chasky was crawling out of the rubble, his face black with soot blood running from a cut on his forehead. Behind him came Timber Jack, dragging Klaus Ritter by the collar. Ritter's leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and he was screaming high, thin screams that sounded barely human. From deep inside the mountain came a rumble, low and ominous. The ground shook. A section of the hillside above the mine entrance slumped, sliding downward in a slow avalanche of rock and ice and frozen earth. "Back!" Chasky shouted, his voice hoarse. "Get back!" Everyone who could move scrambled away from the collapsing hillside. The rumble grew louder, became a roar, and then the entire upper section of the mine entrance caved in with a sound like the end of the world. A cloud of dust and snow billowed up, blotting out the lantern light. When the dust finally began to clear, the mine was gone. Just a jagged, broken scar on the hillside, and a pile of rubble that would take weeks to clear if anyone ever bothered to try. But in the fresh, exposed rock visible now in the lamplight, and the gray light of approaching dawn, everyone could see the source of the poison. Where the explosion had torn away the overburdened raw stone was exposed, and from cracks in that stone oozed thick streams of heavy gray sludge marked with a deadly metallic sheen. It ran down the hillside in sluggish rivulets, gathering in pools, and from those pools it would seep into the ravine that fed Crow Wing Creek. The evidence Ritter had tried to hide, the evidence Elias's attackers had tried to destroy, was now laid bare for everyone to see. Rattler Pike staggered forward, staring at the gray sludge. He reached out and touched it with one finger, then brought the finger to his nose. The smell was bitter chemical wrong. He looked at Ritter, who lay in the snow with his broken leg twisted beneath him and his face twisted with rage and grief. "My sister drank this," Rattler said, his voice low and shaking. "For 6 weeks I watched her die. You told me it was God's will. You told me it was just bad luck." He drew back his boot to kick Ritter, but Timberjack stepped between them. "No," Jack said, his voice hard. "He answers to a judge, not a mob." He pulled Ritter's hands behind his back and tied them with rope, his movements rough but efficient. The crowd that had come to hang an Indian now stood in silence, looking at the poisoned sludge and the ruined mine, and the broken man who had lied to them all. Behind them, a final tremor ran through the mountain. The weakened tunnel system collapsed inward with a muffled roar, sending up a final plume of dust. Anyone still inside would have been crushed, instantly buried under tons of rock with no hope of recovery. The sun was rising now, pale and cold, and in its light, Buffalo Gap looked smaller and more fragile than ever, a collection of rough buildings huddled at the foot of a mountain that had nearly killed them all. Dr. Elias Turner arrived at the mine 2 hours later, dragged on a sled by Anton Novak's patient mule. His broken leg was splinted and bound, his face still swollen from the beating, but his eyes were clear and sharp. He examined the exposed seepage with a professional eye, collecting fresh samples in the few jars he had managed to scrounge from townspeople's kitchens. He compared the gray sludge to the stains in Edmund's notebook, and he nodded slowly. "Mercury amalgam and tailings," he said, his voice rough but certain. "Dumped directly into the watershed. This is what has been poisoning the creek. This is what has been killing the children." In the wrecked yard of the mine, with Lakota families and townspeople gathered together, Elias read aloud from Edmund's notebook. He read the dates and the quantities and the payments made to officials who should have been enforcing territorial law. He read the notes in the margins, the calculations, the evidence of deliberate wrongdoing. Timberjack stood up and told the crowd about Ritter's plan to destroy the evidence, about the orders Cobb had been following, about the conspiracy to silence anyone who asked inconvenient questions. Rattler Pike, his voice breaking, testified that Ritter had paid him to discourage people who complained about the water, to start rumors about Lakota cattle theft, to make life dangerous for anyone who would not stay quiet. Marion, her thin shoulders squared with determination, described the argument she had overheard between Edmund and Ritter, the threats that had been made just days before the mine collapse. Anton Novak, in his halting English, spoke about his daughter's tremors, about how they had stopped when he switched to well water from a different source, about the other families he knew who had suffered the same symptoms. And Chasky, speaking slowly, so that his English would be understood clearly by everyone, described the sickness in the Lakota camp, the children who had died, the families who had been told their suffering was simply the way of things. Sheriff Harlan Cobb tried to slip away during the testimonies, but Timberjack saw him and blocked his path. "The notebook says you took silver to look the other way," Jack said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "It says you falsified death reports. It says you threatened witnesses. You are done, Cobb." He took Cobb's badge and gun there in front of everyone, stripping the corrupt lawman of his authority and leaving him standing, diminished, in the snow. Word rode out that same day. Riders carried letters to Judge Bartholomew Price in Raven Rock, to the Territorial Marshal, to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. The letters included copies of key pages from Edmund's notebook, sworn statements from multiple witnesses, and Dr. Elias's medical records documenting the pattern of mercury poisoning. It would take time for the wheels of justice to turn, but they were turning now, and everyone in Buffalo Gap knew it. Judge Price arrived in late April when the snow had finally melted and the creek ran high and clear with meltwater. He was a stern, gray-haired man in his 60s with a reputation for fairness and a fondness for making examples of people who thought they were above the law. He held court in Buffalo Gap's town hall for 3 days, hearing testimony from dozens of witnesses. Klaus Ritter, his legs still in splints, sat in chains throughout the proceedings. His lawyer, a nervous young man from Raven Rock, who had been paid in advance and could not afford to give the money back, tried to argue that the notebook was unreliable, that Edmund Weber had been mentally unstable, that the mine had followed all reasonable safety precautions given the primitive state of territorial regulations. But the evidence was too substantial to dismiss. The exposed seepage was visible for anyone to see. Dr. Elias's medical records showed a clear pattern of mercury poisoning centered around Crow Wing Creek. Multiple witnesses testified to seeing midnight dumping operations. The payments to Cobb were documented in Ritter's own account books, which had been seized from his office. On the third day, Judge Price rendered his verdict. Klaus Ritter was convicted of manslaughter in the deaths of Edmund Weber and 11 other miners and of criminal fraud in his systematic underreporting of silver extraction to avoid territorial taxes. There was no specific law against polluting waterways in 1855, but there were laws against causing death through negligent disregard for human safety, and those laws were enough. Harlan Cobb was found guilty of accepting bribes, falsifying official death reports, and obstruction of justice. The sentences were harsh. Ritter would spend 15 years in the territorial prison. Cobb would spend 7. Both men were also ordered to forfeit their property and assets, which would be sold at public auction to pay restitution to the victims' families. The mine itself, along with all its equipment and the remaining ore, was seized by the territorial government. Under the laws of the time, families of men who had died in industrial accidents had a legal claim as creditors against the estate. It was not a modern victim compensation fund, but it was something, and for people who had been living on nothing, something was everything. Violet received a settlement that was modest by any standard, $300 for Edmund's death and unpaid wages, along with cancellation of all her debts. But $300 was more money than she had ever seen in her life. It was enough to start over, to imagine a future, to stop kneeling in the snow. An investor from Raven Rock approached her privately, offering to reopen the mine with proper safety measures and offering her a partnership stake in exchange for her silence about the past. He was smooth and well-dressed and spoke of modern methods and reformed practices. Violet looked at him for a long moment, thinking about Edmund, thinking about the 12 men buried under Black Mesa, thinking about the Lakota children who had coughed themselves to death. Then she said very clearly, "That mountain has eaten enough men. Let it rest." She used part of her settlement to enter into partnership with Winifred Calder. They reopened the eating house together under new management with a new rule that Winifred insisted on, and the town council, now led by Sheriff Timberjack Jensen, who had been elected to replace Cobb, reluctantly endorsed. During severe storms, no woman or child would be turned away hungry, regardless of race or ability to pay, as long as there was flour in the bin and wood in the stove. Winifred enforced this rule with an iron will and a loaded rifle kept behind the counter. She had spent too many years being hard, being practical, being the woman who looked away. She was finished with that. If charity was now bad for business, then business could go to hell. The Lakota families, for their part, received a portion of the auction proceeds in the form of tools, seed horses, and cloth tangible goods, not promises. Chaske used his share to help his people move their camp farther upstream to a cleaner stretch of water where the fish began to return and the beaver built new dams. The sickness faded slowly. Children stopped coughing. Women sang at their work again. The bond between Chaske and Violet grew slowly, carefully, in the quiet work of rebuilding. There were no dramatic declarations, no passionate embraces. Instead, there were small things accumulating like snow. when a drunk ranch hand cornered Violet behind the eating house one evening in June, grabbing her arm and snarling that she had gotten above herself, thinking she was some kind of queen now. It was Violet who reacted first. She pulled Edmund's old revolver from her apron pocket. She carried it everywhere now, always loaded, always ready. And she fired a single shot that kicked up dust 6 inches from the man's boot. Her voice was steady as stone when she said, "Get off my property." Chosky arrived a moment later, but he did not take over. He simply stood beside her, silent and solid, and the drunk read the situation correctly and left. After the man was gone, Chosky looked at Violet and nodded once, a gesture of respect between equals. They worked together through the summer, Violet and Chosky sharing the labor of keeping both the town and the Lakota camp supplied with food. They loaded wagons with flour and dried beans. They helped Anton with his harvest. They built a new root cellar behind the eating house where winter stores could be kept safe. And in all of this work, their hands sometimes touched, passing a rope, steadying a wagon, sharing the weight of a heavy sack, and the touches began to linger. There were no words spoken about what was growing between them. Words would have been inadequate anyway, or premature, or simply unnecessary. They had survived together. They had fought together. They had stood against power and corruption and won barely by the narrowest of margins. That shared history was a language of its own, more eloquent than any declaration could have been. On a cold morning in December, exactly 1 year and 3 weeks after Chosky had first knelt beside Violet in the snow, a thin girl with a younger brother in tow arrived at the edge of Buffalo Gap. They were immigrants, German-speaking, hollow-eyed from the trail. Their parents had died of cholera 3 weeks out from Fort Bridger, and they had walked the rest of the way alone, following rumors of a town where work might be found. They stood outside the eating house, staring at the sign in the window, "Storm bread, free to women and children." The girl was perhaps 14, the boy maybe 7. Neither of them could read English, but they recognized the word free. And they looked at each other with the desperate hope of people who had nearly given up. Violet came out of the eating house, her apron dusted with flour, her hands strong and capable. Chosky was beside her, wearing his buffalo robe against the cold, his face weathered but calm. The twins, now a year older, healthy and bright-eyed, and chattering in a mix of English and the Lakota words Chosky had taught them, clung to Violet's skirts. The German girl spoke in halting, broken English, explaining that they had no money, no family, nowhere to go. Violet looked at Chosky. He looked back at her. No words were exchanged, but a decision was made in the space between their glances. Chosky lifted a 50-pound sack of flour as easily as if it were a child's toy and gestured toward the door. Violet put her hand on the girl's shoulder and guided her toward the warmth inside. "Your brother will not go hungry here," Violet said, speaking slowly so the girl could understand. "Not while we stand watch." The words were an echo of Chosky's promise from a year ago, but they belonged to both of them now, to the whole hard, imperfect town that had learned through pain and death and near destruction that looking away from suffering was the same as causing it. Snow began to fall again, soft and clean, covering the scars on Black Mesa and the rough graves on the hill. Buffalo Gap would never be paradise. It would always be a hard place, a place where survival was never guaranteed, and winter was never kind. But something had changed in the town's character, something subtle but real. When the next storm came 3 days later, 7 families sought shelter at the eating house. 3 were white homesteaders whose cabins had been buried in drifts. 4 were Lakota, including an old woman who needed medicine that only Dr. Elias could provide. Winifred Calder fed them all without comment, her mouth a thin line, but her hands steady as she ladled out soup and sliced bread. Timberjack, making his evening rounds, stopped by to check on everyone. Anton Novak brought milk and eggs from his surviving cows, refusing payment. Marion, no longer indentured after Winifred had torn up the contract, in a moment of uncharacteristic sentiment, worked beside Violet in the kitchen, teaching the German girl how to measure flour. And Chasky, who had every reason to ride back to his people's camp and never return to this white man's town, stayed. He sat near the stove with the twins on his lap, telling them a story in Lakota about a rabbit who was too clever for his own good. The children did not understand all the words, but they understood the rhythm of the story, the warmth of his voice, the safety of his presence. Violet stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room, watching this scene. She thought about Edmund, about the choices he had made and the price he had paid. She thought about how close she had come to losing everything: her children, her life, her very humanity. She thought about Chaske's promise made in the snow when she had been too numb and broken to believe that promises meant anything anymore. He looked up and met her eyes across the crowded room, and something passed between them: recognition, gratitude, and the slow-growing certainty that whatever happened next, they would face it standing together. She crossed the room and sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. He did not move away. Neither did she. It was a small thing, that touch barely noticeable to anyone who was not paying close attention. But it was also everything a promise kept, a future glimpsed, a choice made not out of desperation, but out of something quieter and more durable. Outside, the storm howled around the eaves of the building, but inside the stove burned warm, and the lamps glowed steady. Children slept, old people rested. Strangers became, for one night at least, something like community. And in the spring, when the snow finally melted and the creek ran clear and cold, when the grass turned green on the hillsides and the wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion, Chaske and Violet walked up to Black Mesa together. They stood looking at the ruined mine, at the rockfall that had sealed it shut, at the place where so much death and greed and suffering had been concentrated. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Chaske said quietly, "It is finished now." "Yes," Violet said. "It is finished." They turned their backs on the mountain and walked down together, hand in hand, toward the town that had nearly destroyed itself. And then, at the last possible moment, chosen something different. Chosen to stand. Chosen to remember. Chosen to promise that the children would not starve again, and to mean it. It was not a fairy tale ending. There would be more winters, more storms, more hardship. Prejudice would not vanish overnight, nor would hunger, nor would the casual cruelty that men visit upon each other when they believe no one is watching. But something had shifted in Buffalo Gap, and everyone who had lived through that terrible winter felt it. They had looked into the face of their own capacity for evil, for looking away, for choosing convenience over conscience, and they had chosen, however imperfectly and incompletely, to be better. That was the promise in the snow. Not perfection, not paradise. Just the stubborn, hard-won determination to stand watch over the vulnerable, to speak truth when silence was easier to reach out. A hand even when reaching out was dangerous. It was a small promise made in a small town in the middle of a wilderness that did not care whether humans lived or died. But to the people who made it and kept it, it was everything. And it was enough.